Hey, what's up, everybody? My name's Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Hope you all are having a very merry, happy holidays, whatever you celebrate. I don't really care. That being said, today we are going to be talking about controlling your mud pies. And I think that there needs to be something said as a disclaimer beforehand because the whole point of doing the quote unquote mud pie sound design jams or something is to like release yourself of inhibition and just do stuff with sounds or whatever. But something that I've realized is that if I kind of pay attention towards using specific effects in order to achieve a specific result, then it will benefit me in making it usable for the context of what I want it to do. That's a mouthful. Let me explain. So, when it comes into what we're talking about, anyways, this sound design jam, mud pie, whatever, I hope to God that we can get over that name at some point. I'm gonna just say sound design jam for now. But basically, the gist of it is when we throw on a bunch of effects, kind of like so. I don't know why I keep pulling up dual delay. And let's say you've got something like this and a shaper table, and I'm literally like just clicking the first thing that I see. Let's say you grab something kind of like random and then you grab this and go haywire with whatever you got, which can sometimes lead you down some roads rather that can be very fun and interesting and all that other stuff. And this is all fine and dandy. And I think that when you are learning sound design, there should definitely be a time and place for when you are doing this. Or if you find yourself accustomed to doing this not so often, and maybe you've got like just a key thing that works, returning to this and trying to break out of your sound design routine can be, again, extremely helpful. The thing with this, though, is that whenever we do something like this, there's the part of discovery. So let's say I change this to a sine wave. I don't know what this is going to sound like, but let's just play a couple of notes. It's pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, so I'm gonna add just a little bit of FM to this, and to make this kind of work as well, I'm gonna add just a little bit of this and maybe on a second, so that way now we're gonna get a few different timbres. Cool. So let's say we have a session, and let's say one way that we do this is record a melody or something, or let's say we don't. Let's say what we do is we just take this and we start recording from here, and I'm going to play in the key of D sharp minor, E flat minor. Cool. So on one end, if we pull up something like rolling sampler, then I've got all this sound and that I can start kind of cutting up. The other thing is that I've got this MIDI here, to which I broke some of the rules and changed some of the modes on this, but it's fine. Or sorry, changed modality a couple of times. Would that be the way to say that? So in any case, what is cool is that we've got kind of two and two. The one side is that I can continue to shape this however I want to. The other thing is that if I just want to jump into audio and start trying to find a hook, I can do that as well. So, before I go any further, I think that it's really important to understand that if you have the sound design prowess, then you can turn anything into any kind of sound. That does not mean that you can turn any sound into any sound. It means that you can turn any sound into any kind of sound. I've proven that point a bunch of times on my website, sorry, on my YouTube channel, in several videos. But yeah, absolutely. If you want to change this into a pad, you can. If you want to change this into a bass, you can. You want to change it into a snare, that's definitely possible. Is it going to be a good snare? Not necessarily. With that being said, because of the effects that I've used with a lot of this stuff, I understand that this is going to have a certain predictable outcome. And what that means is a lot of these things are going to be kind of washed harmony and might not always lead to something that might be techy if I wanted to, or might not always lead to something that has a very clear and distinct sound. So, what I mean by that is if we kind of just cycle through some of this stuff, you can hear that it's kind of smeary, right? And that's because we used a lot of delays. We used a lot of things that mesh sounds together. And this is great for ambience. So maybe we can find something that might be a nice ambient loop. Just listening. Okay, so maybe something like this. And one cool thing about having this stuff in audio is that you don't have to like maintain the key. You can do something like I did in the last video, which is repitching or changing it up and doing something similar. And so when we repitch this, if we kind of turn this up and then we kind of loop it and just listen to it for a sec, then we might get something kind of cool. That was a bit much, sorry. So I really like this. This is not so interesting, so don't be afraid to cut it and try to find something else. And then what I'll do is I'll put that right on the money here and then try to find a different call. So one other thing that you can do is that if you time stretch this, which is kind of exclusive to Bitwig, but you do it exactly at 50% or 200%, then you'll jump an octave. So what I can do with this is try to jump an octave here and see if I can get this to match up with the second piece. It's kind of cool. So maybe we can find a riff kind of like that. So So the thing is that like, yeah, we can absolutely find a riff out of this, but you hear how it's kind of messy, it's kind of smeary, it's kind of not so clear with what the melody is. This isn't something that you can sing. It does have a repetition, it does have a pattern to it, but it's not like you might be able to sing this part, the do, but other than that, everything else after that is just kind of smeared out. So this kind of drives my point home with understanding that putting intention into the kinds of things that you want to come out of this, when you reach that point, is going to help you out a lot. So let's say I want this to be a pluck, you know. One thing that I can do with this is make this into pluck territory, and then instead of using all of these spatial things, other than maybe the chorus and ensemble, I'm going to remove a lot of the tails of what we have. And the reason why is because if we kind of just keep this here, and maybe we can give just a little bit to have a nice middle ground, then the notation of what I'm getting ready to play is going to be a lot more clear. So if I hit this, let's go ahead and try that recording again. And what I want to do with this is try to find something that is going to be a little bit more recognizable. So one thing that I'll do is I want to make sure that this ensemble is not on all the time. Maybe make it only go up to like 50%. And this is a middle ground that we're finding behind making something that's experimental versus something that is going to be a little bit more thought out and have a little bit more intention. So as you'll see, I am pulling this delay back, but I'm going to kind of put this out here so that way sometimes we've got a very short delay. And the kinds of effects that I'll be messing with are going to be more relative towards preserving the pitch of the mids. Maybe something else that we can do is another short amount of space, because if I do something like this, it's going to be too long, right? But if I do something kind of like here to where I'm a little bit more reserved with it and I'm starting to find this just right, it's going to work out a little bit better. The other thing that I can do is, even though I might feel like I'm restricted with what kinds of effects I can use on here, the other thing, especially something that I love about Faceplant, and this isn't restricted to Faceplant, but just something to be aware of, is that you can do something like this to where now you're going to have a different random or whatever. Let's say we do this at like a fourth, that is going to play with different amounts of FM in between. So we've got FM from this, then we also have FM from this. And if we set this up kind of like so, now you're going to see that we're going to have a little bit more dynamism here. We can also put more skill points or whatever into doing this too, because as you'll notice, we can change up the waveform. And maybe because I know that we're going to be adding harmonics, I might do something else that could be like a filter table where we can pull up anything really. Maybe I'll find something that's a user and adjust this to say trash panda. Don't ask. Um, it's not important, okay? But maybe we've got something like this to where we're kind of jumping around and messing with the mix. This will mess with the cutoff just a bit. And then on this one, we can make this mess with the wavetable. So now we're going to have a lot more timbres as opposed to playing with spaces and stuff. But if my theory proves correct, this should have a lot more sounds and whatnot that are going to be more distinct. And because we'll have that distinction, it'll be easier for us to find something that will have a more definitive hook. Sorry, that was hard to say, but let's try that. So now that we've got all this stuff, whenever we go through the same processing chain now, or the same mindset, the same approach, for one, we don't necessarily even have to do time stretching. We can, but we might just have a moment here that's like, oh, that was really cool. And it could be very simple. It might just be one note. Right? Okay, so this is actually something that will work. The timing of it is off, but if you listen to this and we kind of just roll with it, one thing that we can do is move this off here, and then we can kind of just pseudo-quantize this in a way that's going to make sense from a pattern perspective. And it doesn't necessarily need to be like right on the money. For example, this can be a little bit off, kind of like so. But if we take inspiration from this, maybe just shift this a little bit. Now we've got a 1-bar hook that might be repeatable. And the thing is like, this might be your starting point, and then you're like, I've got another melody in mind. But this is really just to kind of help you get to the next thing, the next making more decisions like I've talked about in my other video. But if we listen to this, I'm going to move this a little bit late, and that way it's going to repeat a little more naturally. So and I've just kind of stretched it out, but we have the do, 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 right? Something else that you can do as well is grab this and set this to repitch like I said before, but instead of repitching this around and playing with the timing of it, you might even play with like, what happens if I make the track slower? See what I'm saying? But the whole point of this was that whenever I made this little stupid loop or whatever, it was a means of making sure that it was going to be functional as a lead sound, right? So in the same way, if I'm wanting to do things that are in the world of bass, I might not use a chorus and ensemble. I might still use like a convolver or whatever, but I would focus more on the low end and all that stuff. But maybe I would have a bigger emphasis on filtering and whatnot. So I can kind of show you what that means or what that looks like. So maybe while I'm making stuff like this, I go back and I have something kind of like here. And yeah, let's just say that we're going to use a saw wave and make it super fat. So we'll stick to a super distorted saw wave, kind of like so. Yeah, nice. Jesus, my ears. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to focus on having a few different filter shapes and just kind of play around with different movements like that. So yeah, let's just grab something here and let's go wiggle jazz. Shout out to jazz. And we could do random or we can do a sequence or something of the sort. It's kind of insignificant when we're talking about generating these quote unquote quote pies. But one thing I'll do is set this to never. And then if I duplicate this, yoink, and change this, and that means that even though these are going to be repeating at the same time, or sorry, changing at the same time, synced up, it's never going to reset back to the same position. And so if I start to play stuff over this, you see how I'm getting different timbres out of this, which is really cool. So if you have a melody, maybe something that is a little bit more defined, something that is a little bit more repeatable, having something that is always consistent is generally your friend when it comes into randomization. But let's say I have, you know, oh God. Do, 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 da, da. Da, da. Yeah. So let's say we're doing like a dubstep tune or something, right? Like, and something else that could be super helpful as well is doing a variation of this, or maybe 2 or 3 variations. So we can go. Cool. So now that we have something like that, whenever we're starting to make these variations, we can take different pieces of it and do a couple of things. Maybe once we have something that we like, for example, we can just leave it here. But then once we have that loop and we take it out and it's all nice and curated for us, we can start to do different stuff where we start playing around with different things. So for example, maybe I set this here and we're going to go crazy with effects, but we're going to do it that's respecting what the purpose of this sound is supposed to be. Does that make sense? So I want it to be a bass, but I want to make sure that it's functional and try to utilize this in a manner that is going to keep it in the world of being, you know, a bass of some sort or whatever. And I think that it's really important to reiterate the fact that if you do this, like, yeah, you're kind of confining yourself to specific means of sound design or whatever. And I will say that this is a nice middle ground, but at any point in time, you can jump off and just be like, screw this, is going to be something completely different, you know? But for the sake of just starting and having something to work off of, this can be super helpful. Because now that we have the main riff and it's all clean and stuff, we can kind of do something where it would be kind of like this. So let me just let this run a few times. Right. So this is a very basic version of this. But what's really cool now is that if we line this up, this should be on time, right? I think so, anyways. And so what we can do is take a bunch of different versions of this, and we don't need to use the whole thing. We can take something kind of like this and place this down here. Maybe right here we take this out, and then we just match the waveform to whatever this is supposed to be. So maybe just this part. And maybe right here we're just going to kind of duplicate that and fill this in and let the rest of that play out. And you'll notice that I didn't take the whole thing. I just did a couple of moments. And what's cool about this is that now that we have this, when we repeat this or whatever, we're just going to have different versions of the same expression. And one thing that's really important to consider with this is that, like, this is going to be most helpful, and this is something that I struggle with. And right now it sounds good because it's just a bass on its own, but something that I personally struggle with is making a really fat functional bass that I'm happy with from the get-go. I think that my issue is that I tend to make my drums too loud, and so when it comes into making a bass or something, because it's all about relativity, right? It's all about how does it sound versus another thing. But if you're just doing this as a means of practice, yeah, absolutely. This workflow is super nice. But listen, so we'll have this be vanilla on the first go. And then when it starts to phrase itself on these repeats, then we'll have these different versions to start to work off of, which I think is really nice. And then maybe something that we can do as well is just take a wild card, if you will, and just do this. I don't know what this is, but it might work. It might not. So let's take a listen to this now and look at the difference. I'm also going to turn this down because I don't need to impress you with the loudness of this. It's just a matter of context. Right. And so the more that we kind of give ourselves these different variations and stuff through this, the more that we're going to be able to kind of like play off of this one riff track, because that's kind of what this is. I think that a lot of times if you only have a single riff through the track, it's pretty easy, because what we can do with this is just have a but you can easily do this again in several iterations and replace it with a square now, or rephrase this in a way, or maybe you do have a different melody or whatever that goes into something else. But if you at least have a good foundation that has good solid bases and stuff, then once you understand that, at least in my opinion, in my approach, that's when you can start to get into things of like, all right, now let's make it sound like neuro or whatever. Typically speaking, these sound a lot better if you have like a Reese or something that's detuned, to which maybe you do that on the run through. But if you have something that, let's just go for glitch, because this is going to make it sound wild and crazy. So I'm going to turn this up and make sure that this isn't going to be too loud. But now if we listen to this, listen to like the variations and stuff that we'll get. So So trying to find those small moments, kind of like this, I think it was in here, and you're not looking for the whole thing to be replaced. You're looking for little hits and bits of gold and whatnot. But the reason why this is a little bit easier to work with is because it already works. So, you can replace something like this, which is kind of cool. There was a little Reese thing in here that I thought was kind of nice. Or just taking a little sound like this and throwing that through an OTT or something and letting that be your fill, kind of like this. It doesn't even matter if it's off key, because you can just pitch it and make it close. Because this is a fill, it doesn't really matter if this has bass or not. You just chuck it in there and do what you want to do. But yeah, like you can add like flangers and just like OTT the hell out of it, because it's just meant to be an effect. And I think that when we talk about like neurobass and stuff, this is where this stuff fits in, especially for the slower kind of music. But hopefully that makes sense in a way that like really taking the time to spend fortifying your foundation for these sounds are going to be extremely helpful, because they're usable, right? So even though they might not be the most interesting, if you can get a fat sound and you understand this approach to how to twist them, but you kind of start paying respect to, or maybe do it a couple of times. Like maybe the first time you pay respect to the kind of sound that you're going for, so you are deliberate with the kinds of effects that you experiment with. So they might be different and a little bit unpredictable, but you're not going crazy trying to like smash low end onto, trying to smash reverb onto your low end or something like that. And then you do it again to where it's completely bonkers, completely experimental, and then you just are searching for different sounds that are going to accompany or going to complement the choices that you've already made when you're developing this. Hopefully that makes sense. This is kind of where my head's at with production, and I hope that this resonates with some people in a means of gaining more control over, for one, just experiment, right? Just go ham. Be that kid that combines all the colors of Play-Doh. But then you start looking at the box, and then you're like, well, maybe I can build a house, but now I'm going to change the colors of the house. Or now that I understand, how to build this spaceship, I realize that if I rearrange these sounds, it's still a spaceship, but it's a different version of it. I don't know. Legos seem to usually make sense to me. But anyways, that's my spiel on this, and hopefully that was helpful. Let me know what you all think. If you want to support the channel, check out alchemy.com, where I've got my music, my sounds, um, sample packs, all different kinds of stuff there. Or you can grab a lesson with me if you want to dive further into this. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.